Hi there. So my name is Gerard DeTrolio, and I am the coordinator of the Trade Justice Network, based out of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And just for those of you that are joining us or watching this later, um, the Trade Justice Network is a network of a number of trade unions and civil society organizations across Canada that advocate on trade issues, a lot of education policy. I have been attending a number of trade union conventions lately, talking about, obviously, from our perspective, the big issue in Canada lately has been the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or CUSMA. That does take up a lot of my time. We just recently had cross-border protests on the US-Canada border a couple of weeks ago about this. And of course, July 1st was the review date that's come and gone. But I mean, while that takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room, obviously, with everything ongoing in the United States, Canada itself is engaged in about seven or eight different free trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties concurrently. And these are a lot of issues that I find very fascinating and that I like to work on. Specifically, Canada has signed a big deal with the United Arab Emirates, and Prime Minister Mark Carney has um, just arrived, I believe, in Saudi Arabia to negotiate more trade agreements with the Saudi government. But that being said, also, my background, I am a PhD student in labor studies at McMaster University, and in my teaching and my research, I take a very internationalist perspective on things. I have done, for my own work, I've interviewed gig workers in South Africa. And so wanted to get a global perspective in these webinars that the Trade Justice Network has started to, is going to start to host on a semi-regular basis. And I know that there are a lot of great work going on around the world on trade issues. And I think sort of like the Tanzania Trade and Investment Coalition sort of caught my eye and was very, very interested. And I took a look at their website and saw that. And I thought that would be a great first idea. So I reached out, and I was connected here with Ezekiel Carreri. Is that how it's pronounced?
Yes, Kereri,
Yes.
yes.
Karate. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So of the Tanzania Trade and Investment Coalition. So I will just hand it over to you, Ezekiel. You should be able to share your screen and everything like that. And we will hold a questions and answers afterwards. If you look on your somewhere on your sort of things for the other viewers and participants, there should be a Q&A box. So if you just click on the Q&A box, it might be under your More tab. Just put in any questions that you may have that pop up for Ezekiel, and we'll get to that after he's finished his presentation. So go right ahead, Ezekiel.
Um, Thank you very much. As Gerard introduced me, I work with Tanzania Trade and Investment Coalition, TATIC, of which we are based in Dar es Salaam. I hope my slide is visible, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So TATIC works along the trade and investment agreements in Tanzania, but also policy landscape and so forth. We have been working on this issue since 2018, of which it was a new emerging, landscape where there was no much attention on trade and investment issues, but then it brings us into that attention, of which we managed to be able to work on it, including work on research, advocacy work, engagement, and so forth, and awareness raising, of which we've managed to provide several trainings to government and non-government actors, to provide a general understanding on trade and investment coalition. Trade and investment agreements in general. So if to start with is to look at of this agreement in general. The trade and investment agreements are signed by states. What is happening? My slide is not moving. Oh, now it's moving. Okay. So, the global trend on economic, political, and social issues, were driven by the trade and investment issues. Yeah. And countries after the colonial period, and the independence, post-independence work, then countries started to look into coalitions among each other, but also assign into several agreements to try to attract investment, but also, to facilitate trades among themselves, of which, these agreements might be in bilateral, which means in between few countries or two countries, but also multilateral, as we are familiar with, including the multilateral one. It can include, the WTO agreement, but also other, regional economic blocks agreements, of which facilitate trading among countries. So these regulatory frameworks has evolved to facilitate international business throughout countries, and for which countries and other regional intergovernmental organizations, take into, enter into this agreement to facilitate, to reach the market, but also promoting economic globalization across countries. And over the past 60 years of international laws practice, the African countries were more consumers of what was provided by the global market, including receivers of FDIs, but also consumers of what is produced by other countries. So, developed countries facilitated and tried to mobilize and developing countries to enter into this agreement. And this agreement were meant really for protection of investment that was there in those countries before independence, but also facilitate more protections for those investment in those countries in a fear of, expropriation or nationalization, where countries then move into the socialist and movement, of which they nationalize all the colonial properties and investment. So developing countries were most the takers of those bilateral investment treaties that were drafted by capital exporting countries, the West, and including the European Union, US, and Canada. But also the East African country also signed several agreements especially the booming of it happened in 1990s to 2000. But the first draft of the bilateral investment treaties as one to protect those investments was signed in 1960s. Beside this, BITs as one of the model or agreement for protection of investment, also countries sign other regional agreements. As I said, including the regional economic blocks, but also the new one that we have, the new baby that we have, AFCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area, which will also facilitate the trading among African states. While East African Community member states are part of the AFCFTA, they do also have several economic bloc and agreement that they have signed to facilitate their trading and investment, of which you find they are in SADC, some are in East African Community, some are in COMESA, the others are in Central Economic Bloc, the IGAD, and the general that we have is the AFCFTA, which most countries are part of it. All these agreements were signed just to facilitate trading, but also to protect investment. And some of the trading agreement, especially the economic bloc, has a component of investment protection, but also investment facilitation, of which it provides some protection for investment. And whether in form of BITs or certain chapter or it's a protocol within CFTA, these agreements have just main purposes of providing protections, and then it has the really definition of the investment as provided, of which we see the controversies along the definition, of which several definitions result into legal complications. These agreements also do provide standard investment protection, including protection against expropriation, fair and equitable treatment standard, but also non-discriminatory standards, which form part of most favored nation national treatment. But also they provide a security for dispute mechanism settlement under ICSID or any other arbitration tribunal that will help to provide protection of investment through, from expropriation, of which it happens that investors feel like they are not protected when they rely on local courts, including, for instance, national courts and so forth, with the fear that the international arbitration centers are mostly, good for them and for their protection. When we look on this agreement, as I said, we do have the FTAs, but also as regional economic blocks, as I said, and which these are the part of facilitating trading. Despite those, there's also those multilateral agreement to facilitate trading, which form part of also those agreements. We do have the AGOA, the EPA, but also the TIFA with the US, where Tanzania and most of East African countries have signed with the US, and the other that we have signed with European Union to facilitate trading. And some of those also, credit. Others have just accepted what was provided, finding it, for instance, other countries were not part of negotiation of EPA, but also others just, did not accept it despite other members take it and agreed to work on it. With international investment agreements also, when you focus, they are mostly promote and protect foreign investments in a host state, and they're mostly for those capital exporting countries are the one, pressurizing their countries to sign. Investors from those countries pressurize their countries to sign, and of which we see several investment agreements. Over 2,000 were signed across. And Tanzania by itself has more than 22 signed agreements. We'll see the statistic later. These also agreements were designed to overlook the importance, fail to overlook, the importance of environmental and social consideration, but also the aspect of police space within a country. Those are it is repeated. So European country used most of these active BITs with the African state, but new actors also has engaged in adopting IEAs with African countries. For instance, China has over 36 with African states, where Turkey being active, and have recently concluded other BITs, including Tanzania, which is the current signed BITs. We know that there are also more agreements that were in negotiation stages. And the early initiative of the BITs between African and European countries were driven by colonial links heritage. And if you look at the agreement that were signed, they are mostly linked to the colonial history between that country with, the European country that they signed with. And this follow the traditional approach. This agreement follow the traditional approaches of treaty elaboration by capital exporting countries, with the guarantee of those protection, including full security, most favored nation treatment, fair and equitable treatment, but also a non-discriminatory protection, which may result from direct or indirect expropriation. This clause is also dealing with the transfer fund, which gives opportunity for the investor transfer fund from, where they've invested to their home country without restriction. And if anything happened by the country restricting them to transfer their capital, then it may result into arbitration. And we have seen that East African member state, the few that I've managed to cover, which are Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, DRC, Rwanda, and Burundi, they have in total around 105 bilateral investment treaties, but also have 22 agreement with investment protections. Those are the one they have with other countries, including the TIFA, the EPA, but also the regional blocks agreement, of which they do provide also the investment protection. Despite those all agreements that they have signed, the trading pattern within these countries have an interlinkage of several economic blocks that they form. You find one country is a member of more than one economic bloc. For instance, DRC having, COMESA, EXA, IGAD, EAC, and SADC as a member, but also others do have their membership, including the Central Sahel agreement on development. We have the EAC, the COMESA again. Kenya also is part of the 4 trading bloc, of which they form agreements, but also Tanzania is part of 2, the EAC and SADC. All those agreements, all these trading agreements they have signed also form part of those agreements. And I didn't include the largest one that we have with the AFCFTA, of which all members also are part of it. With those agreements that they have signed, the value of trading between these countries, given the agreement that they have signed to facilitate their trading, the East African countries has a volume around 9.04 billion US dollars to 13 in 2023. So it keeps growing, as you can see on this pattern. It shows the volume of trading is keeping increasing among the state. The only challenge is that most of the product that they trade among themselves are agricultural produce, of which mostly are not finished products, but rather raw materials. Maybe the value could have been much higher if the trading, pattern was more for manufactured goods, which have more value. The agreements also that were signed are a bit used by investors to evade a lot of issues. We have an issue with treaty shopping. You find some countries that are loophole countries, including, for instance, in Africa, we normally know Mauritius as one of the treaty shopping country with mailbox companies in the country, and some also in Netherlands for the EU. But these treaties that we sign, other countries benefit from it rather than the signatories of the agreements. They also used, the challenge on focus on investors protection than assigning their obligations. They focus more putting pressure on countries to give more favors to investors rather than assign responsibilities to investors to respect and adhere to the right of host state communities. Another issue that was raised by these BITs or any other agreement is that it restricts the policy space. We find it's difficult for a country or a state to regulate it or to change any policy for their public interest. And some have resulted into arbitration issues. We have example in Tanzania. Tanzania have changed just few laws, including the permanent sovereignty over natural resources and the review of contracts law, which was changed in 2017. Then it resulted into more than 3 cases that were taken to International Court of Arbitration for settlement. And the few cases that were decided, the country have paid the investors of the production that they've never started at the beginning. It was related on mining license, where the companies from Canada, UK have sued the government over the abolition of retention license, which was given then, given the regulation that was there in place before 2017. Then after the review of regulation, then it resulted into abolishing all the retention license, because it was the assumption was that the investors used that as a tool to hold the land, but also potential resources that need to be given to other investors to invest. So also the BIT also exposed the set a significant legal risk and liabilities. As I mentioned, the example I've given on Tanzania aspect, in a nutshell, is that when I look on the AFCFTA as one of the major agreement and a bigger agreement that we have, trading agreement that we have, it looks similar with the US, the Northern American FTA, of which it is now in a big challenge. You have also signed the same or similar thing, but it happens that we are not now operating in a good relationship given the political landscape that we experienced. But in Africa, then we also have the AFCFTA, of which 49 countries out of 54 have deposited their instrument of ratification. Only 5 did not submit, and only 1 member state, because African countries are 55, but only Eritrea failed to sign and agree to enter into the agreement. The start of the FCFTA was launched in 2021. Since it is entering into force, it focused mostly finalizing some of the agreements and negotiations on various protocols, and we have a bit of we have a try of trading to see if it works. The GTI, of which the lesson learned is that some of the goods take more than 2 months to reach to customers. So you see the complexity of realizing the potential that the African state have in relation to the opportunities that we had with a market of over 1.4 billion people. But then the accessibility became a challenge. EAC have taken some initiative in putting provisional schedule of tariff and concession of category A products, of which almost 90% of the total tariff lines were submitted for the 10 years time frame from 1st January, including the tariff line of 41% already zero rated and 10% banned account to 1,136 tariff lines, while 25 banned accounts to 1,844 tariff lines are also working on it. So you see the East African community is also taking initiative to make it happening. With regard to the policy landscape to facilitate the AFCFTA, is that these economic blocks have been, have put some levels of integration and trading among countries. So it takes to leverage what was there before, So the regional economic blocks were used as a leverage to facilitate the implementation of the AFCFTA, but also build what was already existing through REGs, and also draw from the best practices. And East African community is mostly advanced integration that we have in the region. It's one of the best because it has reached a high level of integration compared to others. And Article 18 Part 3 states that AFCFTA agreement shall not nullify or modify or revoke any right or obligation existing before between state parties. So if you find the regional blocks that, the regional trading agreement that we have with East African member states, the AfCFTA cannot nullify it or modify it, but rather it will leave it as it was existing. The only thing that was accepted that all countries has to review and to nullify is on any bilateral investment treaties that was existing before. It was supposed to, it has given a grace period of 5 years to nullify all, because we have the investment protocol under AfCFTA, which it gives the right also, and all the critical provision under BITs provided for the member state to leverage that. It also intends to recognize the progress that was made by REX, as I said, like EAC, which is more deeply integrated, and experience gained in its implementation. The EAC, like other REX, continue to apply regional trade regime for intertrading, and the scope of agreements provided all those tariff and non-tariff barriers and as phytosanitary standard and trade facilitation, remedies, and service and other protocols have provided a policy frameworks which made significant progress toward the achieving of AfCFTA. Because if you look, for instance, in each economic blocks, they have several agreement on tariff, non-tariff barriers, and other agreements, of which the AfCFTA take a leverage, to reach out and also to benefit from what was existing. If I'm moving too fast, you let me know. Yeah, okay. So we see countries are trying to sign all these trade agreements. What are the benefits out of it? We see that Tanzania is a signatory of several, Kenya, Uganda, and any other member state. All the purpose and benefit that they think it will benefit them is just to get market access. The EAC has more than 120 million people. So to get access to that market is, it create and expand the consumer base so that it facilitate trading among countries, but also it facilitate growth. Increased trading and stimulate economic activities. It can lead to job creations, revenue generation, and so forth, which result into development in a country. But this needs to be realized by seeing the real impact when it's happening, but also it's facilitate investment opportunities. Currently, for instance, in EAC, East African community member state, they allow free movement of goods and services, but also capital from one country to another. So that movement also give opportunity for investors to, to invest in any member state country, to be able to access the market given the stable trade environment. The other benefit that it has is just consumer benefit. You'll have options to make options to choose from goods with lower prices, but also have better satisfaction with customers. So you are given ample, you'll have options to choose which one you want to purchase given the availability, in the market. With investment agreements, the benefit that was preassumed to be the benefit, if it is at all, is attracting foreign direct investment, because why I'm saying so is that there's a challenge related to, say, attracting foreign direct investment. Several studies have confirmed that this is not true, despite that it is expected to, attract more investment. The finding shows there is no really a direct correlation between foreign direct investment that goes into a country with them signing those agreements, but also the aspect of dispute settlements. It gives a protection mechanism where investors will be able to bring claims directly against the state and claim compensation when an expropriation happens. But the challenges related to this agreement, as I said before, including the treaty shopping, where countries are using it as example in Mauritius and Netherlands, but also there's a challenge of imbalance where, developed countries sign an agreement with developing countries. So you find it's one-way benefit because you find Tanzanian, for instance, Tanzania exporting capital to the US or Canada. It's very rare, but rather it's developed country benefiting from the agreement rather than developing countries. But also the challenge is that it leads to policy constraint. Countries cannot really change the law, and if you change and happens, as I said, with the mining regulations, it results into compensation to foreign companies. And the legal exposure, it exposed the country into international arbitration, which result to a costly liability. Challenges with trade agreements. One of the major concerns is the displacement of workers, because industries that cannot compete with imports may result into closure. For instance, if, for instance, a country has a comparative advantage in producing a certain goods, if you import to another country which has a high cost of production, then it results into closure into that country. Then workers will lose jobs. But also it leads to a challenge of sovereignty issues. It requires country to harmonize their regulation and standard to meet the agreement. For instance, the AFCFTA and member states, you have to align all your standards. And if other countries have lower standard, then you have to balance with the others. We see also, for instance, the policy spacing, for instance, in Tanzania, and I mean, how the Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda operates is that normally they present their budget in the same period, so that any country can trick the others to add any additional tariff, for instance, or any other taxes on certain goods. So you lose your sovereignty over that because you have to abide with others, not necessarily how you want it. But also there's an issue on equal benefit. For instance, those with more, like for instance, in East Africa, Kenya could benefit much compared to Tanzania in trading because of the capital, the economy. Their economy is more competitive and large compared to us. We have issues that we don't agree with them, and that's leading into some of the restrictions. We have agreed to have free movement of goods and people, but we see challenges that they cannot, we see the challenges, especially, for instance, on land issues and labor movement. Sometimes we have agreed that labor movement should be allowed, but at the same time, we fight against each other that, we don't need your laborers to move that way. On the land ownership itself, we see complexity on that because we fear them to overturn on us, despite the fact that Tanzania have a competitive, we have a competitive advantage in supplying of agricultural produce, of which we import more of that. We export more of that to Kenya. Another issue is enforcement and compliance. Ensuring all parties comply with terms of agreement can be difficult. We saw several times, countries, for example, Kenya and Tanzania have several disputes along tax and tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, of which most of the tariff barriers were mostly resolved because countries have agreed on a certain level of tariff. But non-tariff barriers as being a big challenge. There's a concern that every time that they reduce or they solve one one non-tariff barrier, 5 are bonds, several restrictions just to limit the access to market and difficulties on that. And you cannot, you cannot really force the other party to accept. So it takes time to renegotiate and discuss and, lead to trade disruption and so forth. The other concern is the environmental and social concern. We have seen that most of these agreements fail to provide protection of our environment, but also, people's right. We have seen several challenges, for example, in Tanzania mining sector, where when a company, violate environmental standards, these agreements fail to cover that. That is, give exception that at least for environmental issues, but also on policy space, the country should be given an opportunity to have a power to change or to influence or to change policy anytime they seem this is important for public policy. With regard to CSO position in the region, we are organized, especially in trade-related issues, investment and trade-related issues. TATIC is part of East African Trade Network, but also is the member of African Trade Network. The East African Trade Network and African Network, all of our, position is always to look at the audit of all these agreements. We urge the government to review and audit those agreements that are in place. For example, I remember, of course, through the coordination that we have through East African Trade Network, the Netherlands BIT with most of East African member states was terminated. With Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, we did an advocacy which resulted into the termination of the agreement. So we see that we all facilitate that and advocate for the termination. We are all in the same position that this agreement need to be reviewed and audited. But also we urge the government, the position is that CSOs always urge the government to include stakeholders in the process of negotiation and review. The government sometimes look on their interest, and of which it might be influenced by the political will at the higher level. If, for instance, the political position is more of attracting investment, they will sign several agreements, and which may result into, giving out or sacrificing the public space that public policy space to influence that. So the movement along is to influence the government to ensure that they include stakeholders on the negotiation process. We saw some initiative and some of the engagement is happening. For example, in Tanzania, where TATIC has taken some part in negotiation of, for instance, during the AFCFTA protocols and negotiations, TATIC take part of it and facilitate the discussion with the government. So we see the levels, but it's not enough. We don't see ourselves that we manage to influence everything that we think. The other position that CSO also have is to ensure that all these BITs align with our country development strategies, to ensure that not necessarily just signing any treaty, but looking at what is the position of the country and what is intention and the vision that it has, but also provided their development strategies are not limited to those agreements. The other argument that we had is also on strengthening domestic legal capacity to be able to manage dispute settlements instead of using international courts, which are most costful. And one of the examples given is that it's not less than $8 million per case. As the experience that we have seen on the cases that Tanzania had. So it is expensive, but if we manage to strengthen our domestic legal capacity and legal frameworks, then even the investment dispute can be resolved in our countries and in regional arbitration center, where Tanzania was in a stage of establishing its arbitration center. Rwanda has one, and also it can be used by countries closer to that. In conclusion, this trade and investment agreement aims, to strengthen economic integration by providing support to country to address supply side effect, mostly to ensure that it meets the supply constraints, but also expand business opportunity across member state and eliminating unnecessary barrier and facilitate export. This agreement expand choice of consumers by having, lower prices goods, given the supply of goods and services can be, from other countries, but also enhancing competition. However, when these agreements are not managed well, they result into chilling of public policy space and exposure to arbitration, and which country losing public fund for paying corporate compensation from the arbitration. That's it. Thank you very much. Unless if there's any.
Great. Thank you so much, Ezekiel. That was great and really informative. So I will ask if anyone else has a question in a second, but I have a question to start off. And I'm just wondering, given, and it's about manufacturing, I know that Tanzania has, ambitions, I believe, of getting, the manufacturing share of GDP over 20%. Right now, I think it's about 8 to 10%. You've got a few capital intensive firms that don't employ a lot of people. You have more informal manufacturing that may employ a lot of people, but wages and productivity there are stagnant. So I'm just wondering, what's the feeling in Tanzania about how these trade deals are either benefiting or hurting manufacturing potential in the country?
If we see the trading pattern within East African member states, we see opportunities to trade among ourselves, and we didn't see most of the competitive part, because if you see the level of manufacturing that we had across the region is mostly almost the same level. The imported goods from China, India, and other advanced economy are the one creating pressure to local production, but also local industries, given the price competitiveness and cost of production. But that's only that we see as the major challenge, despite the effort that the Tanzania government is providing, most in, the incentives to companies, local companies, but also those who invest within the country, despite it can be an international company, but at least investing in the country, they provide some incentives. Some even given, for example, those in special economic zone are given up to 10 years grace period of some taxes to ensure that they facilitate their production.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay, well, I've got a couple more. What is, maybe not even just Tanzania, but in, say, the East African community, sort of looking at like, what is the sort of when you talk about the shrinking of policy space? I'm just looking at if people there are looking at sort of like what Indonesia has done with its nickel, by basically, banning the raw export of nickel, mostly, I
The raw
think
export,
a
yes.
few
Yeah.
inspections, so that more benefication locally. So I'm just wondering, like, is that something that is on policymakers' eyes? Is there demands for that from unions or anything like that for East Africa?
Yes, even Tanzania, for instance, they didn't really did total ban on export of on an export of raw material, especially on critical minerals, but rather they encourage more, value addition within the country, and they provided some incentive on that. Not only those critical minerals, even gold, for instance, they provided incentive that if if you process it in a certain percent, you are tax exempted I think it was 2% for gold that you are allowed to you exempted if you sell it within the country, but at the certain level of purity that you have made. The challenge, of course, it is in the interest of each nation, and even Tanzania showed us some interest. But the challenge that I saw is not really as an intense and a strong stand that we have as compared to Indonesia, where they totally banned the export of nickel. We also, for instance, in gold processing, established like several processing facilities, but then you find it is more used by local, we say small scale miners rather than large scale miners. And the country has provided incentive of 2% exemptions if you process through that, to ensure that at least everyone process within. The other challenge that I see is that we didn't manage to facilitate using of each other, like East African communities and other regional countries, close or neighboring country, using one country facility, for instance, in gold processing, but also any other value addition in mining. It might be because of some limitation that we have, for instance, in critical mineral, which are in the early stage of development. We are a bit just exporting graphite, despite that we have created a special economic zone for just value addition of critical minerals in Shinyanga. It is in Kahama, where the government is encouraging more of creating the value chain industry within the special economic zone in Kahama for critical minerals. But we are not really using each other potential. For instance, if a country has one maybe processing or manufacturing industry in a country, then we use each other and material and processing within our nationalities. It's still a challenge because everyone is moving alone. We are not coordinated, despite having our integration that we have.
Okay, and we got a question here from Dennis. What
Yeah.
has been the experience with MNCs in advancing Tanzania's trade interests?
Oh yeah, with MNCs, multinational corporations, Tanzania has a few big multi-corporation, especially on mining, of which is a really major multinational corporation that we have. But their interest is mostly focusing on exporting what they have to their market, of which we see it's not really about the Tanzanian trade interest, but rather their market interest. For instance, we have gold producing companies, which are major, which is the first foreign currency earning, and it is really multinational companies that are operating. But if you find where is the market for those goods, they sell it back to Canada and UK, for instance, for the gold mining, including Barrick and Anglo Ashanti, which are major gold producers in Tanzania. With regard to some of the manufacturing goods, the level of production is really limited to not really multinational corporation, but rather middle level companies which are really enjoying the benefit of being within the SADC and EAC market, of which is the mostly part of our trading pattern, and is our trading partners. You see, mostly we import much of the goods from China and India, and oil of which is the other major import. Those countries we trade with them, what we give them is really spices and small agricultural produce, which has limited value. And it is not really like multinational companies that are advancing or using that benefit, but rather just small and medium scale companies. Hope it is clear.
And I have one more question that I thought up of here, because I bring this up only because I got an email this morning that the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law is sort of talking and pushing these changes to ISDS. Although it turns out that these are just slight changes on how the tribunals are run, but more and more countries are sort of turning on ISDS. And obviously, Brazil and India are the two biggest countries that really don't use it at all. So I'm just wondering, what is the perspective of is the Tanzanian government perspective on ISDS changing? What about the rest of the EAC? And are there sort of conflicts because one of your neighbors may accept ISDS, but one is sort of moving away from it. So what's sort of like the status on ISDS reform in the East African community right now?
The East African communities are also against the ICDS because it has costed us a lot of money. No country is really happy of any of those. Even during engagement that we had sometimes before WTO meetings, the focus is always against that. It is the challenge that some countries are afraid to make decision or to pressurize for the review of VIT and exclude that, because investors also are tricky and using their government to negotiate for that and ensure that ICDS is part of that. But Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda that I have experience with, we are all against the ICDS. It's just a challenge that at what level do we want really to go out with it, because you find ourselves that all BITs that we have are all the old BITs, the latest is 2013, I think, and others are even from 1960s to date and has renewed themselves. And even if that we need to review, because we did as we did with Canadian BIT that was terminated in Netherlands, they want to renegotiate, and they don't want to use the new model that they have, but rather they want to use they want to use the old model that was there. For instance, Canada wanted to renegotiate the BIT with Tanzania, and they don't want to use the new Canadian BIT model. They want to use the old model because it has more protection and ICDS protection with them. So you see, despite that, our governments don't need really to have them in the agreements. They are bind. The other challenge that I see sometimes, despite that we want it to be out of our agreements, we fear losing investors. And at the end of the day, we end up putting also the ICDS clauses in our regulations. For instance, Tanzania investment law also include ISDS as part of that, and even it gives clearly the right to use international arbitrations tribunals if investor seems to see any right has been violated. So you see, sometimes we see uncoordinated measures that we fear that we lose investors. At the same time, we see the cost of these arbitration cases several times that countries are paying. For instance, we have the current one that is under ICSID, which is the company is claiming around 1.2 billion US dollars just for the contract termination. You see, so imagine if they win and then Tanzania is supposed to pay that amount of money. It's a hell of money. It's almost like, it's around. It can take even like 3 ministries' annual budget.
Mm-hmm. And just last call for questions. Anything else? Okay, I'll just quickly end. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ezekiel.
No, it's just that if there is any other question specifically before maybe a closing remark, but I allow others to ask questions. But also, because Olivia is there, if there is anything that she wanted to add on that, I believe she's also familiar with all these issues that we are doing and the challenges that we encounter during our intervention.
Thank you, Ezekiel. I really do not have anything because we're always together when we're doing these interventions. So I'll be doing the repetitions. But yeah, just to stress on the issues of ISDS. It's true, yeah. Our governments, when they are attracting investment, they always put that out, that there is a
Oh, we think lost your audio, maybe?
Yeah, we lost her because okay.
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Oh, sorry. I just saw my internet was unstable. Yeah, I was saying they use even the government and the Authority for Investment Promotion, they're using ISDS and ICSID to say it is available. So if you want to come in and invest with us, you are all okay to access ICSID. So it's one thing that they're using to make the investors comfortable so that they can come and invest in our countries. But at the same time, we're seeing what they're doing to us. If we're getting sued in these tribunals, it's a lot of money that could cover a lot of other sectors if we didn't have to pay for these awards. So yeah, Ezekiel, thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion. You've been really good. Thank you.
Just quick, because I don't think we really touched on it too much, but obviously, just wondering about the digital question in terms of digital services. I know that Tanzania has a small but growing tech sector, mostly in Dar es Salaam. Is there bullying by either the United States or the EU or any countries that have the major tech companies on, say, Tanzania or the EAC or other sort of trade blocks in Africa to basically, because this was a big thing, he's bullying Canada on digital regulation. I'm just wondering if you're sort of experiencing that from a lot of the developed countries about digital services.
It's not as much as that, but we also had a challenge with Elon Musk investment in Tanzania with satellite internet and so forth, where the government of Tanzania wanted them to have a physical office in Tanzania to be able to allow to operate. But also the regulation clearly stipulates that to be able to provide that service, you must have an office here. But also, there's a sort of restriction on a share with local available service provider. So we had that discussion. I mean, we had that restriction with Elon Musk, which resulted to some of the misunderstanding and so forth. We know that they have accessed Kenyan market. The claim that now Kenya is having is that they are losing a lot of customers, especially with their local service providers. The bullying is not as much as that. It is just the interest that Elon Musk was pressurizing. Before then, when they were together, they were pushing on that. The current challenge that we had is only on tension on democracy and human rights issues. They are discussing and they presented some discussion on their Senate on some restriction with us. But I believe the government of Tanzania have engaged with them. They might resolve that because they also have interest in Tanzania. They have investment in Tanzania. So the fear is that we had a diplomatic relation. Of course, you see also just last week, we have signed another agreement with them on health-related issues. So it's just give and take, If they see that their benefit is not touched, they're cool. But we didn't really experience a big threat on that.
All right, great. Do you have any closing comments then, Ezekiel, before we wrap up?
Yeah, it's just to say that thank you for the meeting. We expected more people to join. They have registered many, but few turn up. But trade. We see that the trade agreement, in general, has a benefit and challenges. It's just to ensure that we benefit from what we've signed. There is a consumer benefit that we have with, having a plenty of choices that we can choose. But also there's a challenge related to industry and labor displacement. So it is sometimes a good thing to have to access market, but also to have plenty of goods at the cheaper prices. But the challenge that we experience as always is that we put ourselves into a pressure that limit ourselves to regulate. We have seen this has happened as Tanzania has experienced also the same case. So my only just recommendation is that we keep pushing for the review and renegotiation of most of the agreement that we have. We have observed the major challenge that we have with bilateral investment treaties than any other agreement compared to trade agreement, because the trade agreement mostly result into just diplomatic approach to solve. But with investment agreement, it leads to court proceedings and so forth. So this has exposed the government into more paying and using public money to pay for multinational corporations, companies, than providing services. We go and borrow money, while at the same time, the money that we have, we use to pay corporates. So it's a challenge that needs really to be checked and see if we can balance all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, either those that joined us or will be watching this later. We hope to have more of these in the coming months because there's a lot going on. And the issue of trade is not going to be stopping anytime soon. Even with Trump, without Trump, there's a lot of bilateral, trade agreements going on basically to avoid Trump and everything like that. So thank you so much, Joel. And thank you to Tadek and everything. It was great. So take care.
Thank you very much, and welcome, Dennis, to follow up on the mining sector. You're most welcome.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.